Today we will talk about the history and origin of Moloch, the famous god who devoured children in the Bible, and who was even worshipped by King Solomon. Moloch is a very mysterious being, because interestingly, although he is mentioned as an ancient god in almost every bit of research you do on him, there's nothing mythological about him. In this case, he has no temples named after him or priests who worshipped him, except in the Bible. He isn't present or mentioned in any pantheon, including the well-known ones or those in the Bible, like the Canaanite and Phoenician pantheons. It's strange, because although he isn't in any mythology, his name and his image as the devourer of children, which is appearing on the screen now, at the point where the Bible says,
"Look at that son of a Bikas, the pagan, handing the child over to the devil, Baphomet."
It became very famous. Even Super Shandao once called him Baphomet. Moloch has several names and different ways to spell his name. Moloch, Moloch, Molech, Molech, or his more Hebrew name without any vowels, MLK. I really hope I didn't accidentally summon him by saying so many of his names here. Well, the vowels in this name were added, I think, to make it easier to pronounce. But the term MLK means something like Meleki, the king, or a kind of offering ritual. Many people do believe that there really was a god called Moloch, an actual deity, an ancient god. However, there are others who say that the term MLK, or Mook, actually refers only to a sacrifice. It's connected to the Punic language. Jean-Baptiste Chabot connected the Punic term MLK in Moloch to a Syriac verb called MLK, which means to promise. Another scholar named von Sondheim says that actually this term would have originated from a verb, which would be yelk or velk, which means to offer, to present, or an act of presenting something presented. Others still say that actually the Punic word, as well as the Hebrew one, from the verb MLK, has the meaning of possessing or having in Proto-Semitic. Only later did it come to mean something like to rule, and therefore, the original meaning of Moloch would have been something like gift or present, and later it came to mean sacrifice. In any case, this term that originally meant sacrifice became its own god, who became very, very well known. Just like you would become very well known to me if you left a like, subscribed to the channel, shared, and hyped it up too. If you'd like to help even more, consider becoming a channel member. It's very affordable and gives me great support to keep working here. Thank you so much to all the channel members. And another way you can help me is by using the Amazon affiliate links, which are in the pinned comment. All you have to do is buy something from the link, or just click the link and buy whatever you want, whether it's underwear, a pan, anything. That way, a part of it, instead of going to Amazon's millionaire coffers, comes to me, all right? You can also buy what's on the screen or in the description. Well, like I've told you a few times here, Moloch is a biblical god. In other words, he appears in the Bible in several different passages and in several different ways. He mainly appears connected to the expression passing through the fire, as it says in 2 Kings 23 verse 10. The phrase itself doesn't make it very clear that the ritual involves sacrifice, but the Old Testament clearly interprets it that way. He also defiled Topheth, which is in the valley of the sons of Hinnom, so that no one would make his son or his daughter pass through the fire to Moloch. Well, an example of this also appears in Isaiah 57 verse 5, which says the following: "You who burn with lust among the oaks, under every green tree, who slaughter your children in the valleys, under the clefts of the rocks." A few verses later, Moloch is explicitly mentioned in Isaiah 57 verse 9. The text says the following: "You went to Moloch with oil and multiplied your perfumes. You sent your messengers far away and even descended to Sheol." Well, this word and the reference to Sheol, the world of the dead, suggests to us that the fate of the children offered was literally death, handed over to the practices associated with Moloch. In this way, then, although Moloch has a small role in the Old Testament, his figure is very important because it represents the most brutal side of idolatry, reinforcing the prohibition of the second commandment in Leviticus 18:21. The command is very clear: "And you shall not let any of your children pass through Moloch, nor shall you profane the name of your God. I am the Lord." In Leviticus 20-25, Moloch is addressed in more detail, establishing the death penalty by stoning for those who offer their children. Any man of the children of Israel or of the foreigners who sojourn in Israel, who gives any of his descendants to Moloch, shall surely be put to death. The people of the land shall stone him. And I will set my face against that man and will cut him off from among his people, because he has given some of his descendants to Moloch, to defile my sanctuary and to profane my holy name. And if the people of the land in any way hide their eyes from that man when he gives some of his descendants to Moloch, and do not put him to death, then I will set my face against that man and against his family. And I will cut him off along with all those who go astray after him, prostituting themselves after Moloch, from among their people. Well, here it is clear that the sin was not only worshiping Moloch, but also failing to punish those who worshiped him. The text even uses a metaphor, spiritual prostitution, to show how the people betrayed Yahweh by following a foreign god. Apparently, here the text seems to indicate that Moloch really was a pagan god. However, it could also largely be because of the translation, because if they change Moloch to sacrifice, I think the text would have the same meaning or something very close to it. But anyway, these passages give us the idea that the contempt for Moloch arose because his worship was practiced alongside Yahweh, kind of suggesting a forbidden polytheism there. But there's also the possibility that some Israelites were thinking that Moloch was, in some way, one of the forms of Yahweh. The prose sections of Jeremiah there suggest that certain worshippers of Moloch believed that Yahweh had ordered such sacrifices, especially because of the laws about the firstborn mentioned in the Pentateuch, like in Exodus 22:28. However, nevertheless, in Jeremiah 32:35, God ends this line of thinking. However, nevertheless, meanwhile, 35. They built the high places of Baal, which are in the valley of Ben Hinnom, to make their sons and daughters pass through the fire to Moloch, which I did not command them to do, nor did it enter my mind that they should do such an abomination to make Judah sin. Well, however, even so, King Solomon, our dear King Solomon, the wise king, ended up introducing the worship of Moloch in Israel, and after him, many others followed. King Ahaz, for example, burned his own children in the fire. He also burned incense in the valley and burned his children in the fire, according to the abominations of the Gentiles, whom the Lord had driven out from before the children of Israel. I'll skip the part about Solomon for now, since I'll mention him again later, okay? There are interpretations that say that actually, according to these passages, the Israelites may have misunderstood the past laws and believed that God would approve sacrifices to Moloch. This theory is questioned since sacrifices were usually done outside the temple, or in this case, always there in the valley of Hinnom, a place called Topheth, and it's mentioned in 2 Kings 23-10 and Jeremiah 7:31-32, 19:6, and even 11:14. The Septuagint, a Greek version of the Old Testament. The name Moloch appears in 2 Kings 23-10, Jeremiah 30:35, just like in the Masoretic text. However, it doesn't have a definite article. Oh, and just to explain to you what a Masoretic text is, right? Or I think that's how you say it. Sorry if I'm saying it wrong. In this case, it would be the official version of the Bible in Hebrew. To put it simply, okay? Imagine that a long time ago, several different versions of the Old Testament were circulating around. To avoid mistakes, a group of Jewish experts called the Masoretes decided to standardize the text. And that's the one I just mentioned to you. Continuing now, besides that, the Septuagint includes the name Moloch in the book of Amos in a verse where it doesn't appear in the Masoretic text. You carried the tabernacle of Moloch and the star of your god, Rephan, images that you yourselves made. And well, in the Masoretic text, they use the expression your king at some points instead of Moloch. However, the Greek manuscripts, Zephaniah 1:5, ended up using the word Moloch or Milcom in that term. And many English translations follow these variants, reading Moloch or Milcom. On the other hand, the Septuagint does not use the name Moloch in those verses in Leviticus. It simply translates the term as ruler, and in 1 Kings 11:7 it translates it as king. The Greek version of Amos, which contains the name Moloch, is quoted in the New Testament, which explains the only occurrence of the name there in Acts 7:43. It's a passage very similar to what I've already told you here, which says the following: You took up the tabernacle of Moloch, the star of your god Rephan, images that you made to worship them. Therefore, I will carry you away beyond Babylon. Well, among the theories about what Moloch actually was, some say that it wasn't really a specific god, but actually a title given to another god, or maybe even to several other gods, as happens, for example, with Baal. In this case, that title would belong to cultures neighboring the Israelites. For example, some researchers argue that Moloch would actually be the Ammonite god Milcom, due to the phonological similarity between the names. But there's a problem with that line of thinking, which is this. The Old Testament, even though the names do look similar, makes it very clear that these deities are different on several occasions. Mainly when it refers to the national god of the Ammonites as Milcom, and to the god associated with human sacrifice as Moloch, as happens in 1 Kings 11:33 and Zephaniah 1:5. Besides that, the Old Testament usually identifies Moloch as Canaanite, not as Ammonite. The Septuagint uses the name Milcom in 1 Kings 11:7 when criticizing Solomon's religious failures, and not Moloch. But that could end up being explained as a scribe's error in the Hebrew. And because of that, many English translations follow these non-Hebrew versions by rendering the name as Milcom in that passage. But actually, the passage itself would be like this. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of the Moabites, on the mountain that is before Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon. And so he did for all his foreign wives who burned incense and sacrificed to their gods. So in a way, that also makes Solomon a worshiper of Moloch. I told you here that in this case, Moloch being a title for several gods is very similar to what happens with Baal. And incredibly, some scholars claim that Moloch would just be another name for Baal himself, the sacred bull widely worshipped in the ancient Near East. Baal also appears frequently in the Old Testament, and sometimes even alongside the name of Moloch himself. In Jeremiah 32:35, for example, the text mentions rituals dedicated to Baal in the valley of Hinnom, while child sacrifices were offered to Moloch. There are some connections between these two gods, okay? Because we have the name of Moloch within the context of the Canaanite fertility cult, and the main god in this case would be Baal. Besides that, the Bible often mentions the burnt offerings made to Baal himself. But even though a lot suggests that Moloch and Baal are the same god, it's more likely that these examples only indicate that the two were closely related and not unified with each other. The use of distinct names in the context of sacrifices reinforces the idea that Moloch was a deity associated with Baal, perhaps as a kind of subordinate to him, but not equivalent to him. Many say that the fact that Moloch appears so frequently in ancient sources indicates that he was seen as a distinct deity. John Day, in his book Moloch, a god of human sacrifice in the Old Testament, states that there really was a Canaanite god whose name appears as Melech in the Old Testament. Day cites evidence from Ugaritic texts, incantations involving serpents, in which the deity appears as Malik. According to him, Malik is equivalent to Nergal, the Mesopotamian god of the underworld, who appears in ancient lists of Babylonian gods. Day ends up concluding that this evidence matches the malevolent character attributed to Moloch in the Old Testament. In Isaiah 57-9, the prophet ends up comparing the sacrifice to Moloch to a descent into the underworld of Sheol. The god of the world of the dead is exactly the kind of deity someone would worship in the valley of Ben Hinnom, and not on top of a mountain. Well, the fact is that regardless of whether Moloch is a title, a god, or even a type of sacrifice, there really was a symbol of sacrifice. Ancient sacrifices involving children among the ancient Carthaginians. After decades in which scholars denied the existence of child sacrifice among the Carthaginians, new research ended up finding somewhat overwhelming evidence that this civilization really did practice this kind of ritual. A collaborative study with scholars from various institutions, including the University of Oxford, states that Carthaginian parents ritually sacrifice small children as offerings to the gods. The article ends up arguing that attempts to reinterpret the Tophets, which were ancient burial grounds for babies, merely as children's cemeteries, were somewhat mistaken. According to the authors, these practices may even help explain why the Carthaginian civilization was founded. The research brings together literary, epigraphic, archaeological, and historical evidence confirming the Greek and Roman account that prevailed until the 1970s, when scholars began to argue that it was all just anti-Carthaginian propaganda. The study was published in Antiquity, and Dr. Josephine Quinn of Oxford's Faculty of Classics, the article's author, said, "It is becoming increasingly clear that the stories about child sacrifice in Carthage are true. The Romans and Greeks already claimed this, and it increasingly became part of the popular narrative about Carthage in the 18th and 19th centuries. In the 20th century, people began seeing this as racist Greek and Roman propaganda against a political enemy and believed Carthage should be defended from such accusations. What we're saying now is that the archaeological, literary, and documentary evidence is overwhelming. Instead of rejecting this possibility, we should try to understand it. The ancient city-state of Carthage was a Phoenician colony located where Tunisia is today. It existed approximately between 800 BC and 146 BC, when it was destroyed by the Romans. Children, boys and girls, most of them only a few weeks old, were sacrificed in places called tophets. The practice also occurred in other Phoenician colonies in Sicily, Sardinia, and Malta. Over the children's ashes, the parents left dedicatory inscriptions engraved on stones, stating that the god or gods had heard my voice and blessed me. Dr. Quinn also says the following: "Some have tried to argue that these places were just cemeteries for stillborn babies or those who died early. But besides the fact that a weak, sick, or already dead child would be an offering to a god, there are animal remains at these sites, and they are treated the same way. It's hard to imagine how the death of a child could be interpreted as an answer to a prayer. It's hard for us to understand why someone would take part in this, or why a parent would allow it. Perhaps it was due to strong religious devotion or the belief that helping the group was more important than a child's life. We should remember that infant mortality was high, so parents often didn't get attached to children who might not survive their first year." And she continued, "We see this as slander because we think with our own modern categories, but people saw things completely differently 2,500 years ago. In fact, Greek and Roman writers describe child sacrifice more as a historical curiosity than as something monstrous. They weren't even that critical about it. Modern rejection of the idea of child sacrifice began in the second half of the 20th century, led by scholars from Tunisia and Italy, exactly the countries where the tophets were found. Finally, Dr. Quinn says the following: "Carthage was much larger than Athens, and for many centuries more important than Rome. But today it is almost a forgotten city. If we agree that child sacrifice really happened, it helps explain why the colony was founded. Perhaps Carthage's founders left Phoenicia, now Lebanon, due to incoming settlers and disapproval of their common religious practice. The abandonment of children was common in the ancient world, and human sacrifice existed in various societies. But child sacrifice is relatively rare. Perhaps the future Carthaginians were like the Pilgrim Fathers, who left their homeland because they were so devout they were no longer welcome there. Overlooking the possibility of child sacrifice keeps us from seeing a larger picture. So after all this, do you think Moloch was a title? Was he a god who really existed? Or maybe just a translation error being linked to a type of sacrifice? Whatever your opinion, Moloch is definitely one of the most mysterious beings in the Bible. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. See you next time.